There's a moment, and I've seen it happen maybe 3 times in my entire career, where a room goes completely, utterly silent. Not the polite kind of silence, not the everyone's listening kind. The kind where every single being in that room forgets to breathe. I saw that moment happen on a Tuesday. Which is funny, honestly, because Tuesdays are supposed to be boring. Let me back up. My name is Corporal Danny Reyes, and at the time this happened, I had been assigned to the Interstellar Military Exchange Program, IMEP. We called it, for exactly 4 months, 2 weeks and 3 days. I know the exact number because I kept a small notebook in my left breast pocket, and I marked off every day like a prisoner scratching lines into a wall. Not because I hated it. Because I needed to remember that time was still passing, that somewhere back home people were having normal problems, traffic, bad coffee, arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes. Out here, normal didn't exist anymore. The IMEP is, the result of a treaty that took 11 years to negotiate and still makes half the politicians in the Galactic Compact uncomfortable. The idea was simple enough on paper. Member species exchange military personnel for a period of no less than 6 months. You live with them, train with them, eat their food, breathe their recycled air, and hopefully come out understanding each other a little better. On paper, simple. In practice, you wake up every morning and spend 10 minutes just adjusting to the gravity before you can walk to the bathroom. In practice, you eat nutrient paste that tastes like someone described the concept of food to a machine that had never seen food. In practice, you're surrounded by beings who are 8 feet tall on their short days, who have 4 arms, who can see in spectrums you can't even conceptualize, and who look at you with your 2 arms and your soft skin and your laughably short lifespan like you're either a curiosity or a pet. Some of them mean it kindly. Some of them don't. The facility was called Station KL-9. It orbited a moon that orbited a gas giant the color of old bruises, deep purple, swirling with orange storms the size of small continents. I used to stand at the observation window in the mess hall and just stare at it. There was something comforting about it. Something that reminded me that the universe was big and old, and had been doing its thing long before humans figured out fire, and would keep doing its thing long after everything we'd ever built had turned to dust. Sergeant Alma used to tell me to stop staring at the gas giant and eat my paste. I never listened. Sergeant Alma was human, one of only 4 of us assigned to KL-9. The others were Corporal Jinho Park, quiet, methodical, the kind of guy who reads the manual before assembling anything, and Private Sierra Whitlock, who had been in the program for 8 months and had somehow learned to speak passable Velthani, which was impressive because Velthani involves 3 separate tonal registers that the human vocal cords were not designed to produce. Sierra would just kind of push through it, mangle the tones in ways that technically produced different words, but somehow, the Velthani always understood her. We figured they were just being polite, or she'd accidentally become fluent in some kind of regional dialect. We never fully resolved that debate. The other personnel on KL-9 were from 3 species. The Velthani, tall, bipedal, gray-blue skin, 4 arms, large amber eyes with horizontal pupils. Think of something that evolved to be efficient in every possible way and you're partway there. They moved with an economy of motion that made humans look frantic by comparison, even when they were running, even when they were fighting. Everything they did had this precision to it, like waste was a personal insult. Then there were the Keth. The Keth were bulkier than the Velthani, roughly humanoid but wider, with thick ridged skin in various shades of deep green and brown. They had a reputation as the heavy infantry of the Galactic Compact, the ones you sent in when you needed something stopped, or something broken, or a position held until the heat death of the universe, whichever came first. They were also, and I say this with genuine affection, the loudest beings I have ever encountered. When a group of Keth laughed, the walls vibrated. When they argued, you felt it in your back teeth. They argued constantly. They also laughed constantly. Those two things were, for the Keth, essentially the same activity. And finally, the Draxi. The Draxi were the ones that made new human personnel go quiet when they first arrived. 6 limbs, 4 of which could serve as arms or legs depending on what was needed. Heads that were vaguely insectoid, with compound eyes that caught light in strange ways. They moved fast, very fast, and they were quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like silence was a tool they'd learned to use. They were also, from what I could gather, the most technically sophisticated species at the facility. Half the equipment in the training block had been designed or modified by Draxi engineers. 4 species, 1 facility, 1 mission: get better at working together before the next time something went wrong in the galaxy required us to work together anyway. The training programs were coordinated by a team of instructors drawn from all 4 species. For physical conditioning, what we loosely called the strength and endurance block, the lead instructor was a Velthani named Commander Theolris. And Theolris was the reason I was keeping that notebook. The first time I met Theolris, I was lost. Not metaphorically, literally. I had been trying to find the conditioning bay for 20 minutes and had instead found, in order, a water reclamation unit, a storage room full of Keth equipment that smelled like ozone and old metal, and what I later learned was a meditation chamber that I had walked into while 2 Draxi were deep in some kind of focused trance state. They'd opened their compound eyes in slow unison and stared at me until I backed out. I was standing in a corridor, turning my facility map upside down as if that would help. It would not, when someone said, "You are holding that incorrectly." The voice was measured, not unkind but not warm either. I looked up. Theolris was, "I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this sound like I was intimidated, but also I was absolutely intimidated, tall. Very tall. The average Velthani stood around 72 in human terms, and Theolris was, if anything, slightly above average. The gray-blue skin, the amber eyes, the 4 arms crossed in a way that humans can't quite replicate because we lack the joints for it. An instructor's rank insignia on the collar, 3 interlocking rings in silver. Human personnel frequently orient the map with the station's gravitational north at the top, Theolris said, but Kale 9 orientation is calibrated to its orbital trajectory, not gravitational pull. The map's reference point is here. One of the 4 hands reached out and touched the edge of my map, rotating it precisely. "You are looking for the conditioning bay." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," I said. "Commander," Theolris corrected without any particular emphasis. Just a correction, like fixing the map. "Commander, sorry." "Follow." And that was it. Theolris turned and walked, and I followed, and in 3 turns and 90 seconds I was at the conditioning bay. Theolris hadn't said another word the whole way. I stood at the entrance. "Thank you, Commander." Theolris looked back at me with those amber eyes, horizontal pupils. There was an expression there that I would learn to read over the coming weeks, not quite assessment, not quite dismissal, something in between. "Your first session is in 4 minutes, Theolris said. "Do not be late." I was not late. The conditioning bay was massive. I don't have a better word for it. The scale of it hit you when you walked in. The ceilings were high enough that the upper sections of the room were slightly hazy, the light diffusing before it reached the top. The floor was a composite material that gave slightly underfoot, designed, I later learned, to accommodate the different masses and biomechanics of 4 separate species. The Keth alone would have destroyed standard flooring in a week. The equipment filled most of the space. Resistance stations, endurance tracks, mobility training areas, and in the far section of the room, the weight systems. Now, weight systems is probably the wrong term, and I knew that even then. They weren't exactly weights in the human sense. They were resistance calibration units, RCUs, which could simulate gravitational load across a wide range of parameters. Each species had its own baseline calibration. The Velthani system ran significantly heavier than human standard. The Keth system ran heavier still. The Draxi used a different axis of resistance entirely, something to do with the way their skeletal structure was distributed across 6 limbs. And then there was the human standard. The human standard RCU was the smallest one in the bay. It sat in its calibration rack at the end of a row, and I had noticed, during my first week, the way some of the Keth would glance at it, not with contempt exactly, with a kind of confused pity, like watching someone try to dig a trench with a spoon. The Keth didn't mean to be offensive about it, they were just being honest. I'd learned to breathe through it. The structure of the conditioning sessions was straightforward. We ran on a rotating schedule, individual species training in the mornings, cross-species combined sessions twice a week, and then special assessment blocks that Thale Riss used to evaluate progress and adjust programming. The individual sessions were fine. Challenging but fine. My programming was calibrated to human physiology, and I understood what I was doing and why. The combined sessions were where things got interesting. The first time I walked into a combined session and saw a Keth Sergeantrank, name was Gorak, built like someone had stacked 2 humans on top of each other and wrapped them in armor plating, casually warming up with resistance loads that would have required a crane to move on Earth. I had to take a quiet moment to recalibrate my sense of where I fit in this environment. I fit in it as a human, which is not nothing, but it requires a particular kind of confidence to maintain that perspective when you're standing next to something that could accidentally break your arm by patting you on the shoulder. Thale Riss ran the combined sessions with the same precise efficiency as everything else. The structure was clear: warm-up, movement drills, resistance work, endurance block, cooldown. Everyone followed the same sequence. The calibration was individual, each species worked at their own resistance levels, but the sessions ran together, same timing, same space, same supervision. And Thale Riss watched everything. Those amber eyes moved constantly during sessions, tracking form, tracking timing, catching the small things, a Velthani whose third arm position was slightly off in a pulling movement, a Draxi who was favoring one of their lower limbs in the endurance drills. Thale Riss never missed anything. And Thale Riss never, in my experience, raised their voice. The correction always came at normal volume, direct and specific. Raise, your spine is rounding, reset. Gorak, slower on the concentric phase, you are compensating. Third squad, your timing is drifting, attend. I respected it. I respected the consistency of it, and I respected that Thale Riss applied it to everyone equally. There was no species that got softer treatment. The Velthani, who might have expected some professional courtesy from an instructor of their own species, got corrected just as precisely as the Keth and the Draxi and the humans. Equal attention, equal standards, equal exacting precision. What I did not appreciate for a long time was the specific way that equal treatment looked for humans. The first time I noticed it was around week 3. It was a combined resistance session, and Thale Riss was moving through the weight systems block, checking calibrations and observing form. I was working on my set, pushing what I would have considered a solid effort back home, something I'd trained years to reach, when Thale Riss paused at the station next to me. The Velthani trainee at that station was working with a load that made mine look, again, like that spoon in a trench. But Thale Riss watched her and said something to the effect of, "Increase the load by 1 unit. You are not reaching sufficient tension for adaptation." 1 unit in Velthani resistance calibration was not a small increment. The trainee adjusted without hesitation and continued. Thale Riss moved to me. I kept my pace, kept my form, waited. "What is your current load, Raise?" I told them. Thale Riss looked at the calibration readout, looked at me, Can you complete 3 more repetitions at this load? I assessed honestly, yes, Commander. Then it is not your limit. Increase by half a unit. Half a unit in human calibration was meaningful. Not brutal, I could handle it, but meaningful. I adjusted, continued. Thailris moved on. And I thought at the time, okay, that's just coaching. Push until you find the edge. I didn't think much more about it. But then it kept happening. Session after session, week after week, the same pattern emerged. Thailris would observe the other species, Velthani, Keth, Draxi, and occasionally push them up. But the corrections to the other species were about form, about timing, about technique. The adjustments to load were incremental and relatively rare. With me it was every single session. At some point during every session, Thailris would come by, ask if I could do more, and when I said yes, because I was being honest, tell me to increase. And I kept saying yes, because I could, because I was training hard and I was eating what passed for food on this station, and I was sleeping my 8 hours and my body was adapting, the way bodies do when you push them consistently. Every week I was doing more than the week before. But the other trainees at my level, Velthani, Keth, Draxi, who were at equivalent points in their programs, were not being pushed the same way. They were being pushed to their standards. I was being pushed through mine. And I started to wonder why. I mentioned it to Sergeant Alma during one of our bi-weekly check-ins. He was sitting on a bench outside the mess hall, which was the closest thing we had to private space on this station, eating something that might have been a ration bar but had the structural integrity of old concrete. Thailris keeps pushing my load up, I said. That's their job, Alma said without looking up. I know, but they don't do it to the others the same way. The Velthani trainees, the Keth, they get technique corrections. I get load increases every session. Alma bit into his concrete ration bar and chewed for a moment. You keeping up? Yeah, that's the thing, I keep up. But then it's probably fine, Rays. I looked at him. You don't find that interesting? He looked at me for the first time. What I find, Corporal, is that we are guests on this station, in a program that took 11 years to negotiate, and if the instructor is pushing you and you're not injured and you're progressing, then the correct response is to progress. He bit off another chunk of the ration bar. Save the philosophy for when we're home, he said. I dropped it. But I kept noticing. The second thing I noticed, and this one took longer to see because it was more subtle, was the way Thailris talked about limits. In the combined session, Thailris used a consistent phrase when instructing the resistance blocks. I heard it so often it stopped registering as language and just became part of the ambient sound of training. The phrase was, lift what you can. Simple enough, sensible enough, lift what you can. Don't try to be something you're not. Know your capacity and work within it productively. I heard Thailris say it to Velthani trainees. I heard it said to Keth. I heard it said to Draxi. I heard it said to me. But here was the thing I started to notice, slowly, over weeks. When Thailris said it to the Velthani, and a Velthani loaded the bar at their standard warm-up weight and started working through their sets, Thailris watched and moved on. When Thailris said it to the Keth, and a Keth loaded the rack with weight that would have required specialized equipment to move on Earth, Thailris watched and nodded and moved on. When Thailris said it to me, and I loaded my station at my current working weight, which was higher every week than it had been the week before, Thailris watched. And then Thailris asked, is that what you can lift? And I thought about it, actually thought about it. And I said, I could lift more. And Thailris said, then lift more. And every time I did. I don't know exactly when I realized what was happening. It wasn't a sudden moment of clarity. It was more like one of those pictures where the hidden image doesn't appear until you look at it right, and then once you see it, You can't unsee it. Thailris wasn't pushing me because they thought I was falling behind. Thailris was pushing me because they had figured out that I kept saying I could do more. And they were testing every single time whether that was still true. The Tuesday this story is actually about, the Tuesday of the silence, came in the 6th week of combined training. Thailris had announced at the end of the previous session that there would be a formal assessment, the kind with official readouts, logged numbers, documentation that went into program records. Every species personnel would be assessed on their resistance load maximums. A single maximum lift attempt, measured against their baseline and against their own previous assessments, to gauge adaptation and progress. The combined session was already strange when I walked in that morning. There was an energy in the room, I want to say nervous, but that's not quite right for the Velthani, who didn't seem to experience what I would call nervousness. Heightened, maybe. Focused in a different way than usual. The Keth were, if possible, louder than normal, which I hadn't thought was achievable. They were moving through warm-ups with an enthusiasm that bordered on aggressive, which for the Keth was essentially just Tuesday morning. The Draxi were very still. When the Draxi went still, it meant they were concentrating. The assessment was important to them. I went through my warm-up methodically. Incremental loads, standard sequence, nothing unusual. I was trying to get a clear picture of where I was that day. Not the best day I'd ever had. Not the worst. Middle of the road. My sleep had been a little off the night before because one of the Keth barracks was running some kind of celebration that involved enthusiastic percussion until around 200. Percussion with Keth means you felt it through the floor. I was a little tired. I made a note of it and got on with warming up. Thailris ran the assessment in order of species. Velthani first, then Keth, then Draxi, then humans. I watched the other assessments while I continued warming up, keeping my body ready without burning anything I'd need. The Velthani assessments were impressive. Precise, controlled, efficient. They loaded the bar, they lifted, they set it down, they stepped back. No drama. The numbers were logged. Several of them showed meaningful improvement from baseline. Thailris noted each result with the same even tone. Improvement of 12%. Acceptable. Your form degraded slightly at the top of the movement. We will address that. The Keth assessments were loud. Each one was accompanied by a vocal component, somewhere between a grunt and a roar, that the Keth seemed to produce involuntarily at maximum effort. The entire Keth squad cheered for each other in between attempts, which sounded like being next to a structural collapse. The numbers were very, very large. Several of the Keth showed improvement as well, and Thailris noted each with the same precise neutrality. Gorak, improvement of 9%. Your starting position is still generating early spinal compression. I will show you the correction after the session. Gorak nodded seriously. Gorak always nodded seriously at technical corrections. Then one of the other Keth yelled something at him, and he turned and roared back, and they clapped each other on the shoulders so hard it sounded like a car collision. The Draxi assessments were quieter. The Draxi loaded their stations with the methodical efficiency of engineers running a calibration sequence, executed their lifts, logged their results. Several of them showed improvements that, proportionally, were among the highest in the room. Thailris noted this. Third unit improvement of 22%. Your multilimb load distribution has become significantly more efficient. This reflects well on your adaptation to the programming. The Draxi in question dipped their head in a gesture I'd come to recognize as acknowledgement. And then it was our turn. There were 4 of us, Alma, Park, Whitlock, and me. Alma went first. He was a methodical lifter, had been his whole career, not flashy, not dramatic, but consistent. He improved from his baseline. Thailris noted it. Raise goes next. I stepped up to my station. I want to be honest about what the station looked like. The load I was going to attempt was the highest I had ever attempted in my life. It was the result of 6 weeks of being pushed, session by session, past where I thought I was. It was the result of being asked, every single time, is that what you can lift? And every single time saying the honest answer, which was, no, I could lift more. Was it heavy? Yes. Was I sure I could do it? Honestly, 80%, maybe 85. I breathed, set my feet, got my grip. The conditioning bay was not a quiet space. Between the Keth celebration happening in one corner and the ambient sounds of equipment and movement, and the station's environmental systems humming through the walls, it was never quiet. But when I got under that load, it went quieter. Not silent, not yet, but quieter. I noticed, in the peripheral way you notice things when your focus is narrowing to a single point, that a few people nearby had paused. A Velthani who had been moving toward the endurance section had stopped. 2 Keth were watching. I didn't think about them. I executed the lift. And I want to explain something about maximum effort, because it's one of those things that's hard to communicate to people who haven't experienced it. It doesn't feel the way movies make it look. It doesn't feel powerful or triumphant in the moment. In the moment, it feels like every system in your body is having a very urgent disagreement about whether this is a good idea. There's a point somewhere in the middle of a true maximum effort where your body sends you a message. Very clear, very direct. The message is, this is the most I have. I hit that point. And then I pushed past it. Because somewhere in the last 6 weeks, the question, is that what you can lift, had restructured something in the way I thought about limits. I had been asked that question enough times that it had stopped feeling like a challenge and started feeling like a genuine inquiry. A real question, worth a real answer. And the real answer every time turned out to be a little more than I thought. I set the weight down. I stepped back. And the room was silent. Not the polite kind, not the everyone's listening kind. The kind where everyone forgets to breathe. I didn't understand why at first. I heard Theoris's voice before I fully processed what was happening. What was your previous maximum? The commander asked. I gave the number. There was a pause. Theoris looked at the readout, looked at me, back at the readout. Your improvement from baseline, Theoris said, slowly. And I want to emphasize that I had never heard Theoris say anything slowly before in my life, is 41%. I didn't have an immediate response to that. 41%. In 6 weeks. I knew the improvement had been significant. I knew the curve had been steep. But I hadn't been tracking the cumulative percentage. I'd been tracking the sessions, the individual pushes, the individual question, and the individual honest answer. 41%. The Velthani who had paused on his way to the endurance section was still standing there. He was looking at the readout over Theoris's shoulder with an expression I could not fully read, but the horizontal pupils had widened, which I had learned was a sign of something like surprise. One of the Keth, Gorak, said something in Keth. I didn't speak Keth well enough to follow it, but the tone was unmistakable. Something like, did that just happen? Another Keth answered him, same tone. Theoris turned to face the room. Session assessment is paused, Theoris said. Normal volume, absolute clarity. I want every personnel in this bay to look at this readout. There was movement. People came closer, carefully, in the way people move when they're trying not to look like they're rushing. Within 30 seconds, most of the room had gathered in a rough arc around the assessment station. Theoris pointed to the readout. This is Corporal Ray's, human, 6 weeks in the program, 41% improvement from baseline. The room stayed quiet. The highest single-species improvement this session was 22%, Theoris continued. The highest improvement across my previous 6 program cohorts was 28%, achieved by a Velthani trainee who was already considered an exceptional candidate. 41% from a species we, and here Theoris paused, A pause I had never heard from them before, had not historically weighted highly in this assessment category. Another pause. Gorek said in careful, slightly accented universal standard. How? Theoris looked at me, and I realized they were actually asking me to answer. I thought about how to explain it. There in the middle of the conditioning bay, with an audience of Velthani and Keth and Draxi watching me with expressions ranging from curiosity to something I could only describe as recalibration. The sense of a data point arriving that doesn't fit the existing model and is forcing a rewrite. You kept asking me, I said, looking at Theoris, if I could lift more. I ask all personnel that question. I know, but I stopped. How to say this? When you said lift what you can to the others, they loaded what they could lift and they lifted it. That's the correct interpretation of the instruction. Lift to your capacity. Yes, Theoris said, waiting. But I kept hearing the question underneath it. Is that what you can? And the honest answer was always, not quite. There was always a little more, so I kept going for the little more, and the little more became, I gestured at the readout. Silence. And then from somewhere to my left, one of the Velthani trainees said, very quietly, their limit or yours. It wasn't directed at me. It was like thinking out loud, like something clicking into place for them. I looked at her. She was looking at the readout. You were not asking what the load limit was, she said slowly. You were asking what your limit was. Those are different numbers. Yeah, I said. I think they are. What happened after that is harder to describe in a linear way, because it happened in layers. The immediate layer, Alma, Park, and Whitlock completed their assessments. All three showed improvements above what anyone had projected, though none reached my number. Whitlock, who had been in the program longest, came in at 29%. The room, which had not entirely returned to its normal noise level, went through another round of that breathless quiet when her number came up. After the session, Theoris held a brief debrief. This was not standard practice. Debriefs happened at week markers, not after individual sessions. The fact that Theoris called one told me something. The debrief was short. Theoris stood at the front of the room and looked at all four of us, human personnel, and said, I have been running conditioning programs for 11 years. I have trained Velthani, Keth, Draxi, and 4 other species through the exchange program. In that time, I have developed assessment models based on observed adaptation rates. A pause. My model for human adaptation rates was incorrect. Another pause. I am correcting it. That was it. Theoris turned and left. The deeper layer happened over the next few days. I noticed the change first in the combined sessions. The Velthani trainees, who had previously been comfortable loading their standard weights and working within their established ranges, started doing what I had apparently been doing without realizing I was doing anything unusual. They started asking themselves if there was a little more. I'd see them at the resistance stations, pause before loading, reconsider, add weight. The Keth noticed it. Being the Keth, they responded by immediately trying to outdo it. Within 2 sessions, half the Keth squad was attempting loads 10 to 15% above their previous working weights. Not all of them succeeded. Gorek failed a lift on his second attempt, set it down safely, which he'd been trained to do, and the other Keth immediately started yelling at him. But the yelling, I had learned enough Keth to understand, was not mockery. It was something closer to, again, you can do it again. The Draxi response was the most methodical, which was very Draxi. I watched 3 of them sit together after a session with what appeared to be data tablets, working through something I couldn't see. When I asked Sira about it later, she'd been watching too, she said she'd caught enough of their conversation to understand they were recalculating their progression curves, adjusting their models. If the ceiling was higher than the model said, the model needed to change. And Theoris watched all of it. Those amber eyes moving through the sessions, but there was something different in the observation. I couldn't have named it precisely at the time. Looking back, I'd call it interest. Not the baseline professional interest of a good instructor watching their class, something more than that. The interest of someone who has been doing something one way for 11 years and has just been given evidence that there might be another way to do it. 3 days after the assessment, Thalris called me to their office. The office was small and very organized, everything in a place. One window that looked out on the gas giant, deep purple and orange, the storm swirling slow and enormous. Thalris was standing at the window when I came in. "Sit," Thalris said without turning. I sat. For a moment, Thalris just looked at the gas giant. I didn't rush it. I'd learned that the commander's silences were working silences. They meant something was being processed, not that the conversation had stalled. "I reviewed your full session logs," Thalris said finally, "from day one to the assessment." "Okay," I said. "The progression is consistent, not erratic, not a single exceptional session, a steady build week over week, small increments." "Yeah. You were aware of what you were doing." I thought about that. Not exactly. I wasn't tracking the cumulative number, I tried to find the right words. Every time you asked if I could lift more, I asked myself honestly, and honestly I could, so I did. Thalris turned from the window. Those amber eyes, horizontal pupils, looking at me with that expression I'd spent weeks learning to read. Still not entirely readable, but there was something in it I hadn't seen before. "In my experience," Thalris said, "when I ask that question, personnel from most species interpret it as a challenge to their ego. They either say yes when the honest answer is no, because they don't want to appear limited, or they say no when the honest answer is yes, because they're conserving energy or afraid of failure." What do you do with the ones who say yes when the answer is no? Push them back. A dishonest maximum is an injury waiting to happen. And the ones who say no when it's yes. That, Thalris said, is the more common problem. Silence. "Why did you keep answering honestly?" Thalris asked. I thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not just reaching for the first answer. "Because you asked," I said finally, "and it seemed like you actually wanted to know, not as a test, not as a challenge, just as information. So I treated it like information. What's the true answer?" And the true answer was always, "Yeah, a little more." Thalris was quiet for a moment. "A little more," the commander repeated. "Every time, just a little more. Not a lot, not more than I could handle, just whatever was actually available." The amber eyes stayed on me for a moment. Then Thalris looked out the window again. "The previous training model for human personnel used adaptation projections based on observed data from the first 2 cohorts," Thalris said. "The first 2 cohorts showed modest improvement. The model reflected that." "What do you think the first 2 cohorts were doing?" I asked. "I think," Thalris said slowly, "they were lifting what they were told to lift." A pause. "And you were lifting what you could." "There's a difference," I said. "Yes," Thalris said, "there is." I'm going to slow down for a moment, because I want to get this part right. I've told this story a lot over the years. At debriefs, at dinners, at the kind of late-night sessions that happen when a group of people who have been through something are sitting around trying to make sense of it. And every time I tell it, there's a point where people want me to say that Thalris was treating humans as lesser, that the lower projections were deliberate condescension, that the whole thing was about species bias and about us proving ourselves against it. And I get why people want that narrative. It's cleaner. It has a villain and a victory. But that's not what happened, and Thalris wasn't that. Thalris was an instructor working from a model. The model was wrong. When the model was proven wrong, Thalris corrected it. No defensiveness, no face saving, just, the data is the data and the model needs to change. That's not bias finally defeated. That's good science being practiced honestly. The thing that happened in that conditioning bay wasn't a human victory over alien arrogance. It was something quieter and, I think, more important. A question asked and answered honestly, over and over, until the honest answer produced a result that surprised everyone, including me. The week after the assessment, Thales restructured the human conditioning programming. The new structure kept the same framework, same sessions, same blocks, same sequence, but the calibration targets changed. The starting weights changed. The progression model changed. And one other thing changed. The question. Thales still asked it, is that what you can lift? But now Thales asked it to everyone. Not occasionally the way they'd asked the Velthani and Keth and Draxi before, every session, every personnel, every species. Is that what you can lift? And because the room had watched what happened when you answered honestly, because they'd seen the readout, seen the 41%, seen the recalibration happen in real time, the answers started changing. A Velthani trainee named Valith, one of the ones who had been standing in the doorway, who had gone still with wide pupils when my result came up, started adding weight every session. Not dramatically. A small increment the way I had been doing. Week over week, a little more, a little more. By the time I left the program, Valith's numbers had become something the other Velthani trainees were talking about. Gorek, the Keth who had asked how, became genuinely obsessed with the question. I would hear him in the conditioning bay before sessions when the room was only half full, standing at his station and quietly asking himself the question. Out loud sometimes, like a ritual, is that what I can lift? And then he'd load one more plate and find out. The Draxi recalculation, the one I'd seen Sierra observing, turned out to be a formal remodeling of the Draxi progression targets. They presented it to Thales as a group recommendation. Thales reviewed it, approved it, and implemented it within a session. The whole room changed, slowly, week by week, small increments. Because the question had gotten into everyone's head. My last month at Kale 9, something happened that I want to include here because I think it's part of the story. There was a cross-species physical assessment, the kind that was program-wide, documented for the treaty records, a formal demonstration of what the IMEP was producing, different from our internal assessments. This one had observers from the Galactic Compact Coordination Office. It's the kind of thing that, historically, humans don't dominate. The numbers are what they are. A human maximum lift is a Velthani warm-up, and that's just physics. The assessment categories that were weighted by raw output were never going to be human categories. But there were other categories: relative improvement, adaptation rate, consistency of progression. The human cohort from Kale 9 came in first in adaptation rate. Not second, not close second. First, by a margin that the coordination observers asked Thales to verify twice, because they thought there might be a calibration error. There wasn't. Thales verified it both times with the same even tone. When the results were formally announced, Gorak walked over to where I was standing and said, in his careful universal standard, "I understand now. The question." "Yeah," I said. "I have been asking it every session." He paused. He looked like he was choosing words carefully. "My numbers are," he gave me the percentage. It was not 41, but it wasn't what anyone had projected for a Keth at his stage either. "That's not bad, Gorak." "No," he said, "it is not." Another pause. "The question is strange. Every time I think I have reached the limit, the question asks me to look again. And when I look again," he made a gesture with one massive hand, something like, "and there it is, a little more." "Yeah," I said, "that's it exactly." I left Kale 9 on a Thursday. Standard rotation, my 6 months plus change, pack your things, ship out. Thales saw me off. Formally, an instructor seeing a trainee out of the program, but Thalris stopped before the standard dismissal. Raise. Commander. The question you answered differently from others. A pause. Why did you not assume the limit was fixed? I thought about that for a moment. A long moment. The purple gas giant was visible through the corridor window behind Thalris, enormous and slow and ancient. I don't know, I said honestly. I think when I was a kid, someone told me that your limits are usually just the last thing you tried. And if the last thing you tried was last week, then this week you're a different person than the one who set that limit. Thalris was quiet. So every time you asked, I continued, I was checking against the current me, not the me from last session. The amber eyes held for a moment. I will include that in the program documentation, Thalris said. Which was, from Thalris, roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. I nodded, thank you, Commander. Safe journey, Corporal. I walked to the transport. There's a thing that happens, I think, when you spend enough time in a place that was alien to you, when you spend enough time adjusting to gravity you weren't built for, eating food that doesn't quite feel like food, breathing air that's been recycled through systems designed with other lungs in mind. There comes a day when it stops feeling alien. Not comfortable exactly, not home. But not alien. And I felt that on the walk to the transport, the floor material that gave slightly underfoot, the light that was always a little different from sunlight, the ambient sounds of a station that was built by and for beings whose biology was fundamentally different from mine. None of it felt alien anymore. It just felt like where I'd been. And the thing I was carrying out of it, not in my notebook, not in my kit, but somewhere more durable, was a question. Just one question. The kind you'd think was too simple to matter. Is that what you can? Or is there a little more? I've thought about this a lot since. About what it means that a question was more important than any specific answer to it. About what it means that the limit I thought I had, the limit that had been modeled and projected and documented, turned out to be a limit someone else had drawn for me, based on data about other people, in different moments, under different conditions. About what it means that the honest answer every single time was a little more. I don't think it means humans are special. I want to be really clear about that. I don't think this story is about humans being secretly stronger than everyone thought, about us proving something to the galaxy, about triumph in the face of underestimation. I think it's about something else. I think it's about what happens when someone asks you a real question, and you decide to give them a real answer. That's it, that's the whole thing. Thalris asked me, session after session, whether I could do more. And instead of answering based on what I'd done before, or what I thought was expected, or what would make me seem capable without risking failure, I just answered based on what was actually available to me in that moment. And that turned out to be more than the model said. Not because humans are exceptional. Because honest answers are. I went home, had bad coffee. Argued about dishes, got stuck in traffic. All of it felt different. Not because the station had changed me in some dramatic, cinematic way, but because I was carrying the question now. Not just for lifting, not just for conditioning sessions in the bay of an alien military installation. For everything. Is that what you can? I'd be doing something and I'd hear it, not as Thalris's voice, just as a voice. Neutral and precise and genuinely interested in the honest answer. And the honest answer was usually, no, not quite. A little more, just a little more. The last thing you tried is not the same as the last thing you can do, not if any time has passed between them, not if you've been doing the work. Some people ask me when I tell this story, what was the 41%? And I understand the question. They want the dramatic number, the achievement, the proof of something. But here's what I actually think the 41% was. 6 weeks of answering one question honestly. That's all. That's everything. You want to know the real weight that was lifted in that room. Not the load on the bar. The assumption that the limit was already known. That's what came down, and it came down 41% further than anyone thought.